Of course, Korach was one of the sons of Levi. He was not a Kohanim, was not one of the sons of Aaron, but he was a son of a Levi. He was a Levite. And this is about rebellion. And so this area here in the book of Numbers, we have several stunning examples of rebellion on behalf of the people of Israel against Moses, against God. Now, this is a tough part of the Pashan to consider because of all the rebellion. We much prefer to see Israel in good light and not see the reality that they were rebellious, consistently rebellious, all the way up to their dispersion and their time in the diaspora. We much prefer to see Israel in a better light, but lo and behold, today, Israel is in a much better light. Why? Because we live beyond the time of God's chastisement. We can look back and see the incredible unfaithfulness, the incredible rebellion that existed in the people of Israel. Now, this is a very important part of the book of Numbers for us because it highlights and emphasizes for us the human nature, the same nature that exists in each of us. Now, we think of sometimes we want to brand the Jews as the stiff-necked Jews. They're the ones who were continually rebellious against God, and that's why God ended up just pushing them aside. But the frank truth is this: we're no better. And I say we, I mean Christianity. We haven't fared very well in regards to full obedience to God, not acting out in rebellion against His word, because we did, and we do. Israel today is in a place of redemption. Even Paul in Romans chapter 11 said that in this period when God would redeem and bring deliverance to Israel, that He will remove their sins. Even Paul said it in Romans chapter 11. Effectively, all the major prophets and even the minor prophets pointed to that time in the redemption, in the restoration, when God would literally remove their iniquity, their sins. And then every time we see it, it's pointing to what we call end-time events, end-time period. The period that they refer to as the Geulah, the redemption. So, that's where we are. God has removed their sins. They have atoned for their sins. But the ugliness of Numbers, this portion of the book of Numbers, is set before us, and we have to consider it. What we're seeing here with this rebellion is the spirit of exclusion. I refer to it. The spirit of exclusion. Now, what is the spirit of exclusion? It's not a positive, it's not a good spirit, it's an evil spirit. The spirit says that I'm excluded, he's included, she's included, I'm excluded. Why am I excluded and he or she is included? That's a spirit. And this is what Miriam said concerning Moses. Why is he included in the inner circle of what God is doing, and I'm not? Ultimately, she took a stand and said, I am just like you. So that denotes that something awful was at work in Miriam, that her perspective concerning Moses was wrong. She had an ill perspective, a perception deception is what I'll call it, concerning Israel and who he was and what he was about and what he was actually doing. She had a very ill perspective of him. Again, deception, perception. Now, Miriam. Let's go back and let's consider Miriam. We did this a couple of weeks ago. Let's look at it again. Again, the spirit that's at work in Miriam, it's of course jealousy. At the root of it is jealousy, but it's a lack of self-worth, perhaps. But it's the spirit of exclusion again. She is excluded from that inner circle, being close to God. She wants to believe that she is just like Moses, that Moses is no better than her, and therefore she can stand up against Moses because he is no better than her. This denotes psychologically that something is wrong with Miriam, that she is seeing Moses as better than herself. Her perspective is skewed. And because of that skewed perspective, she is led into sin. Who led her into sin? The evil one, of course, because wherever God's people are, appointed for greatness, whenever God has anointed a people and a leader to lead them, well, you would find Satan not very far off. He's usually very close by because he wants to disrupt, he wants to interfere, and ultimately completely destroy what God is doing. So what would he do? What does he have to work with? Jealousy, right? Covetousness, a wrong spirit, and in this case, a spirit of exclusion. And so Miriam here in Numbers chapter 12, I'm going to read 1 and 2. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses. Note, Aaron is involved. Okay? Aaron is being tossed about in these different rebellions. Then Moses and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman, which is an African woman. That complaint was just on the surface. Behind that was this spirit of exclusion. And they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? And the Lord heard it. So, why did Aaron get involved in this? Any ideas? More than likely because he was roped into it through his strong sister, Miriam. Miriam needed an Aaron alongside her to say, has the Lord spoken only to Moses? He's spoken also to us. Mostly Aaron. But she wanted to be included. So that spirit of exclusion will drive you into sin. You want to be like Moses. Well, the truth is, do you really want to be like Moses? Honestly, do you really want to walk in his shoes? Do you really want to experience what he experiences? Or perhaps you just want to be like him in terms of authority. Well, that tells us psychologically or spiritually, you're in a bad place. You're in a place that you shouldn't be in. All right, now this is exactly what happened with, of course, Korach and the man who stood against Moses. So let's begin to look at this. Again, we're dealing with perception, deception. And what I mean by that is quite often, when someone is put into a position of leadership or authority, as Moses was, it is perceived by those who are not correct in their thinking, in other words, with the wrong spirit, that he is sort of lording it over people. Who does he think he is, Moses? God speaks to him, but God speaks to all of us. We're all God's children here. And why must Moses be the one to take precedence over us? Now, if you harbor that spirit, what will happen? Your perception of Moses will invariably be altered. That's what happened. Their perspective of Moses was horribly skewed and altered because of that spirit that was at work in them. And they firmly believed their perception. They were convinced about what they believed that they were seeing, that Moses was selfish, arrogant. You know, he was heavy-handed. He believed that he alone was holy. They all were convinced that this was who Moses was. But he wasn't. He was just carrying out the work that God gave to him. Rather than stand with him and understand the burden of his position, they wanted the glory that was for him. But was there really glory for him? You got to stand in his shoes to understand that question. You know, the American Indians, some of the American Indians would say, you have to walk a mile in my moccasins. And that's absolute. So there was a perception, deception among the people of Israel, and they wanted to hold that high position. What they saw as a high position that really wasn't a high position. It was a position of servitude. And so the rebellion occurs. Let's read about this rebellion concerning Korach. Numbers chapter 16, 1-3. Now Korah, the son of Ishar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, with Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and the son of Peleth, the sons of Reuben, took action. So 2 of the sons of Reuben and 2 of the sons of Levi took action. Who were Reuben and Levi relative to the tribes of Israel?
Servants.
Reuben was number 1, Levi was number 3. All right. It was Reuben, Simeon, Levi. So what had Reuben done? What did he do that nullified his position in leadership? We know the story, right? He took his father's concubine. What about Simeon and Levi? What did they do? They took action ill-advised against Shechem, and therefore nullified their position of leadership. When Jacob blessed his sons, well, Levi and Reuben received really negative blessings from Jacob, from Israel. Their blessings from him were not favorable, right? But here they are. They're saying, hey, we're the leaders of Israel here. Reuben, you're the firstborn. Levi, you're the priestly tribe. We ought to take action. Who is this Moses anyway? Now, they had already seen 3 or 4 occasions where the people of Israel had rose up against Moses. I want to say this, that the seed of rebellion was buried deep within the camp of Israel. And it didn't take much, a little perception, deception, and suddenly there's an arousement of rebellion. So why was that? Because the seed of rebellion was in them. As individuals, we can have that seed of rebellion as well. And every chance we get, we're going to snap against leadership. Because that seed is in us. You might believe that it isn't, and you're justified in your behavior, but you're not. Because your perspective is skewed. You have perception, deception. You might also have a spirit of exclusion. It drives us. It's the nature of the fallen man to be driven by this. It is something that we must recognize, and what must we do with it? If we were to recognize that I have the spirit of exclusion, and I have perception, deception, what do we do with it? We nail it to the cross. You know, usually, and I'm not going to preach too long because we took a lot of time doing what was necessary to be done. I like the fact that we spent time praying together for Israel. We'll do that some more. I'm not going to take up too much of your time, but one of my observances concerning human behavior as a pastor is that we tend to superimpose upon our leaders our very transgressions. The things that we're prone to, our propensities in regards to rebellion and so on, we tend to see them in the people that leads us. That's the deception, perception thing. So if you have a problem, if you're a bit of a kleptomaniac, and it's not yielded to God, you know what a kleptomaniac is, right? If you're a bit of, no, you don't, someone who steals, compulsively steals, if you're a bit of a kleptomaniac, or any particular grievance of spirit in sin, and that's who you are, but it's not confessed, it's in you, it's hidden away in you. Here comes someone in authority, someone that's in a position to guide your life. What is the devil going to do with your little hidden iniquity? Well, he'll have you believing that that guy is stealing from the kitty. He'll have you believing that he's doing something wrong. He's skimming, I can tell. And you know why? Because it's in you. And it's not yielded. So we always superimpose upon the people that lead us our weaknesses, our transgressions. We do it. Now I remember when I was a younger believer, not fully yielded to God, that I would do the very same thing with people I work with. I never did that with Pastor Ken or John. But I did it with people I worked with. And then finally I said, wait a minute, I'm pointing at him as if he's doing what I am guilty of. Human nature. And that's something you have to be careful of because of that perception deception. Korach and Dathan and these leaders of Israel envied Moses because they themselves were hungry for power and they saw Moses in that light. That he is power hungry and that's why he's asserting himself. I don't think Moses was a little bit power hungry. I think honestly, if you ask him, he would have given up some of that power. But it was his position. He had to be loyal to it. So because their perspective was skewed, they had perception deception, they're saying, he's got too much power. It reflects the simple fact that they are hungry for power. The iniquity was in them. So these men, what did they do? They took action. We're leaders here. We're the sons of Israel. We're the first 3 sons of Israel. Let's take action. They took action. They rose up before Moses together with some of the sons of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation chosen in the assembly, men of renown, men who had name. The actual Hebrew word there is Shem, men of name, men who had names for themselves. They were respected. Again, it reflects that they were power hungry. They wanted recognition. They wanted people to look up at them. They were hungry to be recognized. They were hungry for attention. And invariably, that's the same charge they brought against Moses. They assembled together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You have gone far enough, for all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is in their midst. So why do you exalt yourself above the assembly of the Lord?" Reflective completely that they are the ones who would like to be exalted above the people of the Lord. So this was a horrible, horrible charge brought against Moses. Horrible. So Moses says, okay, he did what he would typically do. He takes it to God. He responds by going before God. Then Moses would respond to them in verse 8 to 11. Let's read verse 8 to 11. These are over 200 men, leaders, men of renown, who are power hungry, and they have this perception deception. Spirit of inclusion has led them in that, and they're taking action. Should God not intervene, what would happen? Without God's intervention here, what would have happened? Moses and Aaron would have been stoned. But God intervened, and boy, did he intervene. So let's read about Moses' response. Then Moses said to Korach, "Hear now, you sons of Levi, is it not enough for you that God, the God of Israel, has separated you from the rest of the congregation of Israel?" So, very good statement. It's not enough, Levi, sons of Levi, that God has appointed you to be a servant in the midst of Israel. I would not say to be above, because that's the incorrect perspective of what it is to be a servant. A servant stands below. A servant upholds. Literally, a servant serves. So Moses is saying, it's not enough that God has appointed you to serve Israel. I think about in the context of Messiah, whenever I become a little bit disgruntled or a little bit dissettled or unsettled about things, I have to remind myself, Look at what God has given to me, to us. Isn't it enough that he has given us so much? He's put in our hands such a ministry, and it tends to keep my perspective in the right place. And this is what Moses is attempting to do here. He's attempting to address that perception, deception, and point them in the right direction. To bring you near to himself, to do the service of the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them. And that he has brought you near, Korah, and all your brothers, sons of Levi, with you. And are you seeking to be for the priesthood as well? So the charge or the statement is powerful. He's saying to Korah and his brothers, sons of Levi, God has given you service in Israel, the tabernacle, the furnishings of the tabernacle, the logistics of the tabernacle. But you're seeking to be sons of Aaron, you're seeking to be Kohanim as well. You see, again, the perspective is skewed. They're seeing the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, as lifted up. And they're seeing themselves beneath the Kohanim. The problem is not the Kohanim and their appointed office. The problem is their perception. Now, I come back to that, and I'm reiterating on that, because this is critical. As a pastor now for 12 years, I've seen this beyond being a pastor for 12 years. In my career, in my workplace, in management, I've seen this over and over and over. And it's a horrible human trait that's easy to lay down. It's easy to lay it down. It's not difficult. It requires honesty, brutal honesty it requires, but you can nail it to the cross. You really can. And we all need to. So, they're going for the priesthood. Just having the responsibility of the tabernacle, not enough. Being able to serve Israel, not enough. Therefore, you and all your company are gathered together against the Lord. But as for Aaron, who is he that you grumble against him? So why, this is the same point, he's made the same point that I'm trying to make here. Why are you grumbling against the sons of Aaron? They have more responsibility than you. They are going to be held to a higher standard. You have the responsibility of the tabernacle. You're actually quite better off. In effect, is what he's saying. Who's Aaron? Why? Why would you grumble against him? You really want his position? At some point, there's going to be another transition. As there was a transition with me and Ken, at some point, someone is going to transition with me. And the question I'm going to have for that person, whenever that person manifests, is be sure that you really want this position. Don't want it necessarily just to have it, because it's not glamorous. No. You're not going to make tons of money. You're going to lose sleep. You're going to be buffeted. You're going to be a man of sorrows. Your heart is going to be broken repeatedly. You're going to grieve over people. You're going to bury people. You're going to marry people knowing that they're going to split apart not too far away in the future. Do you really want this? That's the question I'm going to ask. And if he says yes, I'm going to say, be sure that you're called for it. Because if you're not called for it, you might be talented, you might be eloquent, you might be able to make people feel good about themselves and give them holy goosebumps every Sunday morning. But if you're not called, you will make a mess. You will create a disaster. Why are the people of Israel, the sons of Korach, striving, bucking for a responsibility that they couldn't handle? Right? That's what Moses is saying. So what did God do? Well, what did Moses do? Moses said, okay, everyone bring your censers. God's going to prove who is actually anointed for the office of priests. Bring your censers, all of you. And what happened? They all brought their censers. And they brought their censers, and guess what? When they showed up with their censers the next day, the rebellion was so expanded that all of Israel stood at the tent of the meeting in complete rebellion against God. Every man's there with their censer. And so is, you know what a censer is, right? The incense. So every man is there with their censer. God's about to prove that Aaron is the anointed one. Aaron's there with them. But overnight, the rebellion spread throughout the camp of Israel. And the entire camp of Israel is there to support the men in rebellion. This prompted God to move towards complete neutralization of Israel. Why? Because it was the most hideous, what's a good word to use for it? Specter. Specter is a good word. Someone look it up. It was the most hideous specter of rebellion of Hasatan himself. Who's the master of rebellion? Who invented rebellion? Well, of course, we know Satan himself. Well, this picture here that we're about to look at, all of Israel standing with the men of renown, the men in rebellion, God had enough. He had enough. And he was prepared to move forward with his plan to annihilate the Jewish people. Israel. He was. Of course, we know that Moses drops on his knees and he begins to intercede on behalf of Israel, which is his position, which is his office of Messiah, and God heeded to Moses. Not without punishing the guilty. Right? Let's take a look at that. In Numbers chapter 16, verse 19. Thus Korah assembled all of the congregation against them, against Moses, against God, at the doorway of the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. So it wasn't enough that they would rebel against Moses, against God, and that God would put them to the test. God was being fair with them. Every man bring your censer. Aaron, your censer. I'm going to prove who is, in fact, the Kohanim. It wasn't enough that God would test them fairly. They decided open, complete rebellion was what was necessary, because they knew that God would verify that Aaron was the priest. So they knew this. So in order to counter that, let's have a complete rebellion with all of Israel. And this happened overnight. This is the nature of rebellion, folks. Righteousness takes decades to work upon and to build. Rebellion can happen in seconds. One phone call, and you have rebellion. Complete rebellion. On the other hand, again, righteousness, faith, holiness, that's a 3-decade campaign. You understand me? As a pastor, working now for 12 years, I am prepared to work another 20 years just to build the righteousness, the holiness, the faith in this congregation to an acceptable place. Rebellion can happen overnight, and usually does. That's the spirit of rebellion. It's as witchcraft. That's what Samuel said. The spirit of rebellion is, or the spirit of witchcraft is rebellion. Rebellion is the spirit of witchcraft. Witchcraft, you can look at that statement from many angles. What's the essence of witchcraft? I've never been involved in witchcraft, but I can read about it. I've interacted with people who was involved in witchcraft. Witchcraft is spiritually potent, spiritually powerful, and can grip the human soul and capture the human soul without much effort. Well, this is what rebellion is. Rebellion is as witchcraft in that sense. Again, consider it. Moses said, bring your censers out. God's going to prove that Aaron is, in fact, the high priest. They knew that God would validate Aaron. So overnight, word went out. 2 million people. The word went out. Oh, they've got it rigged. Moses is going to rig it up. Aaron's going to be the priest. We've got to stand against this. Let's all arise tomorrow morning. Let's get on the phone. The cell phones were coming out, and they were making connections. They were triangulating. The sun comes up, and there's a complete rebellion in the house of Israel against God. And they're standing before him. This is the most amazing thing about this. All of Israel stood before God in this rebellion. Now, sometimes we struggle to see God as the God that was about to destroy all of Israel. But consider the rebellion of Israel. Now, from a spiritual perspective, Satan was glorified. Satan was magnified, glorified in the camp of Israel, completely given over to him. God had had enough. Remember, there is no forgiveness for Satan. None. There is absolutely no redemption. The blood of Jesus is null and void over those fallen angels. It's not applicable to their existence. So, if someone commits themselves to him and stays in that place, they are in the same position as well. And God had begun to see all of Israel in that light. Because they were in that light. Moses drops to his knees. He intercedes on behalf of Israel. And God relents. God does this 3 times, I believe. At least 3 times. Where Moses would intercede for Israel. And God would relent. Lo and behold, it happens again in tonight's Torah portion. Because after the consequence of their rebellion was executed, which was, what was the consequence of their rebellion? Moses said, God's going to do a new thing. The ground's going to open up and take you rebels into it. Over 200 men and their families were taken into the ground. Now, shortly after that, now just think about it. Shortly after that, the people began to grumble against Moses again, telling Moses that it's because of you that terrible thing happened. You see, the seed of rebellion was so deeply planted into Israel, so profoundly rooted in Israel, that they couldn't get over it. They just saw what happened with Korach and the rebels. They just saw how the earth opened up. Moses is working to prove to them that this rebellion is not going to go well for you. He says, and just to prove to you, he says to them, God's going to do a new thing here to validate what he's doing. The earth is going to open up and take you in. Which is exactly what happened. And even though the people of Israel saw it, they decided to rebel against God again. And grumble against Moses. Saying, Moses, you did this. Human nature is so reflected in these Torah portions. That part of our nature that needs to be nailed to the cross, it is so vivid for us. Even though I don't like necessarily to teach this, I do. I do because it reflects in us aspects of who we are that needs to die. Not just you, but me. All of us. Because that human nature, that fallen human nature, is rich in every human being. And it's something that we have to nail to the cross. How often? Daily. Pick up your cross and follow after me. It's a daily thing. The crucified life. Sometimes I'm like a broken record. Lay down the flesh, die to self, the crucified life. Why am I preaching on this so often? Because we're all in that place where we need to be reminded of the reality that, hey, if we don't keep this fallen nature in check, we're going to run amok. We need to hear this message that there's something at work in each of us that would cause us to be rebels should we not consistently and constantly lay our lives down before God and humble ourselves, remind ourselves, hey, who do you think you are? person? Who do you think you are? Do you deserve any honor? Do you really deserve what God has given you? Did you really work? Did you merit any of the opportunities that God has given to you, person? Then why are you behaving like this? This is a question we must all ask ourselves. People of Israel had a hard time with this. Couldn't see couldn't see Moses in proper light. Let's read about what happened here when the people rebelled against Moses, against God yet again. So in Numbers chapter 16, I'm going to read just 41 and 42. This is where Hasatan, again, he's succeeding upon the people. But on the next day, all the congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, saying, "You are the ones who have caused the death of the Lord's people." There is that manifestation of the spirit of exclusion again, right? Perception, deception at work. It came about, however, when the congregation had assembled against Moses and Aaron, that they turned towards the tent of meeting, and behold, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. You know what follows, right? God shows up in his glory. It meant again that he was prepared to neutralize the people of Israel yet again. This had happened a day before. You see, just a day before. It's happening again. So in this case now, Moses didn't interact with God. You need to read it. You read verses 43 onwards. Moses did not interact with God. You know what he did? He called Aaron. He says, "Let's get on our faces, because there ain't no talking God out of this one. We got to pray our way out of this one." And so Moses and Aaron they begin to intercede and entreat God, and then God was entreated by their correct action. You see, Moses didn't turn to God as he did the last two times and say, "God, how can you do this?" What would the Egyptians say? What would the people of Amalek say if you were to do this thing? He did that before and it worked. This time he knew it wasn't going to work, that the people of Israel had gone too far. His decision to simply prostrate himself before God and minister to God was the right decision. And God implemented a plan to deal with rebellion that actually worked. It actually worked for 40 years. Because after this, we don't see the rebellion until the situation at Bel Peor, 40 years later. What did God do? Well, chapter 17 tells us what he did. He said, "Let all the men bring a rod." Overnight, just set a rod before him at the tent of meeting. And the rod that blossoms is the rod that's going to be the priesthood. In other words, the rod that blossoms is for the priests, high priests. And of course, we know that Aaron's rod blossomed. God provided a miracle for all of Israel to see, that his rod blossomed, and didn't only blossom, it bore fruit overnight. Now, we don't see rebellion after this. It's as if this miracle of the rod blossoming had an effect on Israel, a corporate effect. I don't know the dynamics of it, but it did. Because in chapter 17, everything is suited. The issue concerning the rebellion goes away. Let's read in chapter 17, read 8 to 12. "Now on the next day Moses went into the tent of the testimony, and behold, the rod of Aaron for the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth its buds and produced blossoms, and it bore ripe almonds." Think about it. It didn't only blossom and present its flowers, it bore almonds. Moses then brought out all the rods from the presence of the Lord to all the sons of Israel, and they looked, and each man took his rod. But the Lord said to Moses, "Put back the rod of Aaron before the testimony to be kept as a sign against the rebels. that you may put an end to their grumblings against me, so that they will not die. Now, what happened to the rod that blossomed? It was put into the Ark of the Covenant, a perpetual testimony to Israel that Aaron has been anointed and appointed by him. And apparently it worked. So whenever there was a tendency, a propensity to grumble or to rebel against God, the rod was placed before them. Remember this. Have an Ammon. Have an Ammon. Remember this. And so for whatever reason, and God knows human nature better than anyone, but for whatever reason, this quailed the rebellion in Israel and the grumbling. Thus Moses did, just as the Lord had commanded him, so he did. Then the sons of Israel spoke to Moses, saying, Behold, we perish. Now they're speaking humility. Now they're speaking reality. Something happened. There was deliverance when that rod blossomed before them. Now, I've experienced deliverance. I've witnessed deliverance. I've administered deliverance. This is deliverance. They were delivered in this process because of their confession following this whole episode. Then the sons of Israel spoke to Moses, saying, Behold, we perish. We are dying. We are all dying. Every one who comes near to the tabernacle of the Lord, we must die. Are we to perish completely? Now, this is Israel at a much better place. Israel is at a much better place, and she goes on to do much, much better in regards to serving him. We don't see the rebellion until the end of the 40-year period. That rebellion at the end of the period was really about, we're not going to talk about it, but it was really about Balaam and Balaam's witchcraft, using sensuality as a means to draw Israel into sin, and it worked, unfortunately. So, what can we take away from all of this? There's a lot for us to take away, right? A bunch. Israel completely given over to the evil one. It took a miracle. Now, God had performed many miracles. None of them they've witnessed and seen. Well, they've witnessed all of them, but they didn't actually see them. But the miracle with the rod that blossomed, for whatever reason, spurred deliverance in them, and suddenly their eyes are open. We're going to perish. I think what they're saying here, and if you read it in the Hebrew, it probably reads better. I think what they're saying there in verse 12 and 13 is, we can't live like this. We can't continue like this. We will all perish before God if we continue to rebel and grumble against God. It doesn't say it in the English, but I'm sure it implies it in the Hebrew. Much of my deliverances, many of the times when I was delivered, I came to that very same place. When I lived as a heathen, up until 1991, when I repented and turned, and God filled me with His Holy Spirit, before that, many, many times, God spoke to me and said to me, you're going to die foolishly. You're going to squander your life. And right at the end of that period, I said, you know what, you're right. I can't go on like this. This is ridiculous. I've got to turn my ways. I've got to turn around here. I've got to repent. I've got to change my ways. You see, that's where I believe Israel is in verse 12 and 13. And it does well for them because we don't see that, again, rebellion again. Perception, deception, it's powerful. Powerful. I've seen it. I've seen the power of it. You can convince yourself all sorts of things about your brothers and sisters. 10% of it is correct. Yeah. And usually, there are horrible things that you begin to perceive about your brothers and sisters. What is the solution? How do we deal with this? How do we counteract it? What should have Miriam and Korach, what should they have done relative to their feelings about Moses? What do you think? Get to his tent, drink some of that Turkish coffee, right? Talk about the camels, and then you get to the heart of the matter. Moses, Are you lifting yourself up against us? Is that what I'm seeing? Tell me, am I seeing this right, Moses? Tell me, I want to know. Honest question. And I feel sure that Moses would have given him an honest answer. And you know what would have happened after that dialogue? There would have been deliverance. Korach would have walked away from the tent saying, you know what? I had perception deception about Moses. And I feel much better now. Him and his household would have been saved from that one act of obedience to God. Didn't Jesus say, if you have aught against your brother or your sister, go to them. First deal with that. Because it takes away perception deception. It deals with that spirit that can destroy us. I'm telling you now, as someone who's only been a pastor for 12 years, but have seen the ruin that this brings upon people. Go to your brother and your sister. Interact. There are many, many times it's just a matter of bringing things to light. And suddenly everything's in a better place. Don't store up this stuff. What causes us to store up these frictions, these things that causes strife? Pride, fear, right? Pride, fear. I'm right, he's wrong. I'm afraid that if I go to him, he'll prove that I'm wrong. But I've got to be right. Because I've been talking to people about this, so I must be right. I've convinced my wife about this, so I have to be right. I can't be wrong. Because it means I'll have to go back to those people and say I was completely wrong. Oh, I know. I know. Listen, folks, we have to be willing to be wrong about each other. When it comes to a negative perspective, we have to be willing to see each other in the right light. If something comes up that troubles you about your brother or your sister, go to them. Go to them. It's the only way you will avoid perception deception, and perhaps the only real way for you to deal with exclusion, the spirit of exclusion. Very important. Now, we're not going to see this type of rebellion again until the end of the book of Numbers. So the rest of the book of Numbers here is going to be a little bit boring. We're going to talk about victories that Israel had over the Canaanites, over the Amorites, and so on, until the end when we talk about Balaam and Balak yet again. But take what you've seen here, take what you've learned here about human nature, and take it to heart. Because it exists in each one of us. And it's something we have to nail to the cross. Recognize it, nail it to the cross. That's where it belongs. Okay? Yes. Okay.
So, like, maybe not this past Monday, but the Monday prior, I had to make a confession, Pastor, and after class on Monday night, because I was told by someone who doesn't come here anymore that he didn't like me, and it ate me up. I mean, it ate me up really, really bad, and I had to seek God's face over this. And my husband knows about it, and it was really something that I kept inside for too long, and I didn't know how to handle it until I was moved to do so, and praise God for that, because I feel like I could actually talk to you and not feel uneasy and have all these thoughts running in the back of my mind, negative thoughts, over what was said to me.
Absolutely.
So it ate me up so bad. It did.
So I want to say to you that if that had gone on for a very long time, it would have pushed you away from where God has called you to be. So this person that planted that seed in you, because of their own sin, their own selfishness, perception, deception, their own exclusion spirit, planted something in you that were in them. That's the way it works. That were in them, hoping to drag you into their own rebellion. All right, so you did the right thing, you came to me, and we squared it away. Now, I was kind of shocked by it, because I didn't see it. I usually see things, I know there's something, but I didn't quite know how to pin it down. I usually see these things way in advance. I didn't see it in you. You did a good job in covering it up.
I saw God a lot to help me during this.
So you did the right thing, and guess what happened? You had deliverance. You had deliverance. Your whole family had deliverance. Just by coming to me and clearing the air. And don't let this frown and this face push you away, because a lot of times my frown, my facial expressions are a result of all sorts of things. Body pains, stress, didn't get to sleep last night, whatever it is. Don't let that push you away. Break right through that. You know, sometimes I look like a Klingon, but that's okay. Break right through it and come to me. Come to me. Yeah. So it's what we do, and that's how we're delivered. I think about Israel here. Again, I don't even know, and it's something I have to dig into. I don't even know what the power of the Aaron's rod budding was that brought Israel to deliverance, but it was powerful enough to deliver all of Israel. All of Israel was delivered at that moment when his rod budded. If someone has an idea about that, let me know. But it happened. And God orchestrated that. Powerful, right? Powerful. So, Shabbat Shalom.